Well, today I want to talk to you about the challenge of postmodernity. To begin, you should already have listened to Andy Opie's lecture on postmodernity from his perspective. And so I encourage you, if you haven't done that yet, listen to his lecture first. You'll notice I have some slides here where I define postmodernity. I'm going to kind of breeze through those because Andy has already done an adequate job of dealing with the subject. Um, but I do want to notice that there are really two different types of postmodernity. There's the philosophical version that is taught on the college campuses, and then there's the real world kind that is just pervading our society. That it's hard to define, and yet it is coming through. Thus, probably, as some have put it, postmodernity is less defined than described. It's more of a suspicious attitude against absolute truth claims, accompanied by a situational ethics that justify each person's thoughts and actions as correct and acceptable insofar as they don't hurt or impose themselves upon others. In other words, it's okay if you think you have truth, then I'm suspicious of you. All truth is relative. I've got the truth. My truth is good enough, and I can do what I want, and it's all good. And if it doesn't hurt anyone, why do you care? I've given you a list of characteristics of postmodernity that you can kind of look over. But ultimately, the postmodernity creates a suspicion against a church that would proclaim a quote unquote hypocritical gospel. In other words, they look at us and we say, you shouldn't be, homosexuality is bad. And it's not just a matter of are we homophobic or not, but then we find some of our top leaders are then found to have on the side, while they're preaching that, homosexual relationships. Or we say immorality is bad, while rampant is in the key leaders of the church is immorality. Or we say greed is bad, and then we look at the lavish lifestyles lived off of the money that's coming into the church. And the people in the world look at that and they say that's hypocritical. You can't say that those things are bad publicly while privately you're doing the same things. And so unfortunately, the few that have done that brings a suspicion upon the entire church. Absolutist truth claim that is not actually practiced by those who proclaim it. In other words, we say we have absolute truth, that there will be absolute punishment for people who don't follow our absolute truth. We proclaim it boldly, but then when they look under the covers, it doesn't look like we're living what we preach. So, but yet we think we're good and we're going to heaven and all is fine. And the world's saying either you have absolute truth or you don't. And if you have absolute truth and don't live by it, then you're just a hypocrite. And so they suspect that we're just living in our own imaginations, if you will. The postmodern influence has come upon the church in maybe three basic ways that at least I see. The first is a consumerist approach to church. By that, we've made every individual in church is the consumer. And so the church is a dispenser of goods and services, of religious goods and services. And so we sample. If we're looking for a new church, we don't pray and say, God, I feel here. We don't go to the one closest to us and dig in. We go church shopping. I dare you to find that in the scriptures, church shopping. But there's a consumerist approach. So how the church feels to me and the range and quality of its services has become more important than denominational affiliation, doctrinal distinctives, or the personal integrity of its leadership. In fact, I was reading something out of Barna in his 2017 report, and he says that at this point, 70% of believers who are church, we're only evaluating those who are in church, 70% say they go for their children, not themselves. In other words, they really don't care how good the preaching is. They don't really care how good the services are. They really care how good the children's program is. And of course, certain churches are willing to cater to that. But it has to ask the question. There's nothing wrong with a great children's program. But we have to ask, is that a New Testament goal to create, to feed the consumers of I mean, did they come and evaluate the quality of Jesus's message, and did he temper his message to what made people feel comfortable? The second postmodern influence is relativized values. In other words, there are no absolutes. We may acknowledge that the Bible is true, but belief is subjugated to personal ideals, with our behavior justified and subservient to personal convenience. An oft-heard justification that I hear is, I know what the Bible says, but God understands my situation. It just drives me crazy how many people, they're like, well, you have to understand that, it's important that I live with my boyfriend or I live with my girlfriend before we get married so I can make sure we're compatible. Well, that's not a biblical value, is it? Nowhere I've read that they say you should live together and have sex to make sure you're compatible. Those things will work themselves out, but we justify it. And so we've taken the values of the Bible and we give a mental assent. Yes, it's true, but it's relative. I mean, that's true for everybody else, but God understands me. That's postmodernism. And the third is a lack of commitment to any local church, whereby if I'm whereby if I'm offended by the least small thing, a person, a single sermon, a perceived injury, or anything at all, then I'm justified to leave. And I either sit at home and do nothing and complain, or I find another church and I church shop again and until I'm offended there. And so you get those three working together, which are really all that same attitude. It's all about me and what I think and what I feel, rather than it's all about God. Well, that's postmodernism expressing itself in the values of normal people. And people they'd say, I'm not postmodern, and yet they live out those values. And so it's hard to pastor without catering to those kind of mentalities. Now, what we want to look at, and we're going to look at starting this week on, those realities are in our community, whether we like it or not. And so the church has tried to find different ways of adapting to the cultural changes that are going along around us. We're going to look at two of those this week, the emerging church and the house church, and then we'll look at others in the following weeks. Starting with the emerging church is probably the one model that takes postmodernism most seriously. They recognize postmodernism and they reimagine the church to reach postmodern people. Gibbs and Bulger note that they define the emerging church as communities that practice the way of Jesus within postmodern cultures. So the emerging church tries to encapsulate what does it mean to be a Jesus follower, but how can we take out of it the trappings of the modern church? How can we take out of it the trappings of the past that goes back through Europe and the big cathedrals and the large services? And how can we get back into the reality of Jesus? And I mean, you have to admit, that's a great question to ask. And they take postmodernism seriously. And so they attempt to contextualize and enculturate the gospel and the church to reach postmodern people. Thus, there's a range of approaches from adjusting outward style to completely postmodernizing an understanding of the gospel. The emerging church is not like so much a style as it is an approach. The style can find many different expressions. The approach is, let's find a way to enculturate the gospel into modern society in a way that makes sense to those kind of people. Because of that range, it's impossible to speak of the emerging church as if it was one group or one entity or one anything. It's more an approach, as I've already said. Thus, a sweeping dismissal of the emerging church by some is inappropriate. Instead, each group, each facet, each stream must be dealt with on its own merits. So the people that study this have digested it, and I'm going to follow the form that says 5. I read one that had 13 streams of the emerging church. That was a few years ago. I'm sure they've got 50 now. But just to try to make sense of it, the 5 stream seems to make the most sense to me. So let's take a look at the 5 stream model. The prophetic provocative. Using Old Testament prophetic language, they claim the church needs to move from orthodoxy to orthopraxy. Orthodoxy is ortho is straight in Latin, so orthodoxy is thinking straight. Orthopraxy is doing straight. And so people like Brian McLaren and Peter Rollins, they say we've got to go from teaching truth to living truth out. And I don't care what church you're a part of, that should be a part of our goals. The second stream is postmodern, where they say faith is seeking understanding and trust preceding the apprehension of comprehension of gospel truths. And Doug Paget, kind of what that approach would be is something like, I know I want to believe. I don't know quite what that belief looks like, but I know there's a God and I know that there's love. And so I've got this sense of faith and I want to believe, but I don't know what that looks for. And so they say, embrace people on the pathway. Don't make them come to a full knowledge over here of everything. Embrace them on the pathway. And I suppose a example of that would be the woman caught in adultery. Jesus, after everyone left, and it was just him and this woman, Jesus didn't say, now let me tell you, here's the 15 things you have to believe, and after that you have to be baptized, and now we'll call you a believer. He simply said to her, go and sin no more, with kind of a sense of, okay, you've got this sense, soak in what it means to be right and righteous and faith, and your faith will bring you full circle back around to me, the guy who loved you. And he trusted people in their process of coming to faith rather than demanding a full-orbed acknowledgement of truth before they got there. And there's truth in that. A third stream would be the praxis-oriented. Praxis, again, is deeds. Faith must be lived out. And so they make their expression lived out. So in worship, they call it as a sacred space and ritual. And orthopraxy, living right, is more important than believing right. And mission, participating in the redemptive work of God in the world. And so they focus on doing things in their services. It's how do you act out your faith? And so and maybe rather than us all watching someone stalely watching a band play music, they might have people at tables that are painting or dancing or expressing themselves in various different ways, because their faith and their worship needs to be lived out within that space. They focus on living right, and they don't even care if you believe right. If you live right, it's more important than believing right. Well, there's some truth in that. I mean, you can go to heaven and believe right. I mean, you can go to heaven even if your beliefs are a little messed up, and you can go to hell having all the right beliefs. It's all based upon your relationship with God and whether or not you're living it out. So there is some truth in that. And of course, mission. They're really focused on mission, participating in the redemptive work of God in the world. They're not just doing missions work, but they say, what is God already doing in the world, and how can you participate with what he's already doing? Well, some of that is amazingly effective, and some of that might be a little liberal in its approach. The fourth would be what we might call post-evangelical or post-foundationalist, in that it is not interested in propositional truths at all. We don't care about systematic theology, but in a stored narrative. What we care about is the storied narrative. We care about the story of God, not the truth of God. So how does God work among his people rather than what the people believe about God? So it's all about God, which is good, and what's he doing among the people, which is good, but it doesn't have, and that's why it's called post-evangelical, it doesn't have that hook that then says, if God is doing this good, how will people respond? And it's not about how people respond, about what God is doing. And then the fifth stream, which is, as you can see, we're moving more and more liberal in its approach, is the political. And here you have left-leaning activists who care about the poor and oppose all things religious right. And so, especially in the most recent presidential issues that have come up in election and all that's going on, they just want nothing to do with the religious right because they've seen them as being political, and it's all about moving forth a political agenda. And in the process, the faith and the gospel kind of are getting lost in that agenda. And so what you have is this, you can see, these are radically different ways of approaching, but each of them takes the postmodernity seriously, and they approach it in different ways, some which we would consider admirable and some of which we would call at best questionable. The emerging church, however, has been condemned. I think sometimes because we lump it all as the emerging church as one, we may take the very far left political oriented kind of liberal wing of the emerging churches, and we lump everybody in that and we condemn them. And of course it's different, and unfortunately when things are different, then there's a criticism. There's a criticism of you guys, sit in your church buildings while we're here expressing our faith or whatever, and there's criticisms that go back and forth. Well, let's just be honest. If anyone was around in the 60s, and unfortunately I was, back in the 60s, with the Jesus movement, the same thing took place. The church was like, you can't worship God if you don't have your organ and your hymns, and what are you guys doing? You're bringing the devil music into the church. And it was these wars over worship. Now, I don't think you could, it'd be very hard pressed, except in the most traditional of churches, to find an organ and hymns. I mean, the devil worship, I guess, has become accepted by all. And so, the same kind of things. When new things happen, there's a revolt by the old who feels criticized, and these wars go on. And I don't think these wars are necessary. But that doesn't mean there aren't necessarily some good challenges. One challenge is made by David Kowalski. And let me just read it to you here. He says, I contend that the emerging church movement is guilty of a kind of compromise through embracing postmodern epistemology and accepting this epistemology's practical implications. Emergence efforts to accommodate postmodernism by shaping theology to suit culture, as opposed to merely adapting methods to reach culture, have been every bit as disastrous as liberal scholars' accommodation to modernism. This accommodation follows the removal of a theological foundation as an objective basis for truth, with the rejection of bounded set theology, that is, borders of what is and what is not. With no foundation or boundaries, it becomes practically impossible to say what is or is not Christian truth, or conduct as there is no objective definitions or limits to faith and practice. In other words, if you have a faith or practice that's Jesus-oriented, then you're a believer because you believe in Jesus, and there aren't boundaries that say this is acceptable and this is unacceptable within Christian faith. That's his criticism. Culturally arbitrary opinions are all that remain. Any belief or standard that may then be questioned or challenged. In a postmodernized faith, all beliefs are valid to those who hold them. Well, this is very similar to the secular aspect of this postmodernism, is what we might call, for example, in theology and commentaries and stuff, we call it the reader response. Let me talk about that for a moment. In reader response theology, you take a book. Let's say take the book of Corinthians. Okay, we know Corinthians has some wonderful things about church order, correcting problems, of course. Things about love, correcting problems, of course. Things about Paul's message, things about putting things in order, basically going down a list of answering. The reader response would say something like this. They would say, Paul wrote to the first century, to a specific circumstance, to a specific people. Paul's not here. The people he was addressing aren't here, and the problems that he addressed aren't here anymore. So therefore, the book of 1 Corinthians is irrelevant in its original context and implication. So therefore, the only value there is to the book of 1 Corinthians is for me to read it and ask, does it mean to me? So I can read this and I can say, what do I get out of reading this book? What do I get? What does it mean to me? Not what did Paul mean it to be, not what did the first early church believe it to be. What does it mean to me? And by doing this, then I can reinterpret that theologically any way I want. I can take that aspect of Paul's aspect of the highest thing is love, and I can say, okay, love is important, and I can reinterpret love to any circumstances. Therefore, I love my boyfriend, or I love my girlfriend, or I love my same-sex partner, and therefore the greatest thing is love, so therefore that justifies what I'm doing as right. Well, there's no boundaries in that, and so David Kowalski says, their approach to relativize the gospel is good, but by not having clear boundaries. And someone might say, well, are there clear boundaries? Well, go back into the New Testament, and you find them all over. Paul says, people that, and he'll give a list of 8 or 10 or 12 things. And he says, those people will not be in the kingdom of heaven. Well, that's a boundary. If you're on the inside of this, well, you may or may not make it to heaven, but you're on the outside of that, Paul says, you're not going to be in the kingdom of heaven. Those are boundaries. And the emerging church has tried to get rid of the boundaries. Well, it's been more attractive to postmodern people, but in the process, on occasion, has it crossed out of what we would call, correct Christian expression. Carson also criticizes postmodernity along 4 lines, and you're going to be reading Carson this week, so I don't have to go into too depth here because he can say it for himself, but his 4 things are: postmodernism has trouble thinking that Scripture is the norming norm. In other words, norming norm is how we feel what culture says rather than Scripture, which holds culture accountable. The second thing is postmoderns are reluctant to speak about the true reality of God and are equally suspicious of metaphysics. So they want to talk about the broader, they want to talk about the concrete here and now. Third, the debate between modernism and postmodernism can be seen as outmoded, simplistic, and painfully reductionist. And fourth, if an unchastised postmodernism extends its claims toward raw relativism and denies the possibility of knowing the big picture, it is not only idolatrous and anti-Christian, but borders on the self-refuting and the silly. There's a quote from Carson. So I'll let you kind of chew with Carson since you're going to be reading him anyway. So I want to kind of respond to the issues that have been raised and the emerging church and kind of some of my thoughts on it. So I'm calling this next section a reasoned response. It just so happens that my devotions yesterday morning were on Romans chapter 2, which is so timely to the way the church is perceived by science, by society, and some of the issues we just talked. And let me quote just a few excerpts from Romans chapter 2. Do you suppose, you who judge those who practice such things, and yet do them yourself? Do you suppose, you who judge those who practice such things, and yet you do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? Will you preach against stealing, and then do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you then commit adultery? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So you can say right here in Romans 12, some of this issue is that for the last 20 years, the visible church, the mega large church, the most prominent names in evangelical and Pentecostal society and Catholic, let's call it that as well, the largest, most pronounced names that people are familiar with have been exposed of having an immoral underbelly that's just unacceptable. And so Paul said that if you do those things, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles, and it's your fault. Well, we're living in a society where the name of God, the name of the church is being blasphemed as being hypocritical because we have been just that. And there might be 1 million who've been pure, but if one very visible person is not, that represents the whole. The leaders should be the ones holding the higher standard, as Paul makes his place in Romans chapter 2. Secondly, we must take seriously the impact of the cultural needs of a changing society. We can't just stick our heads in the ground like a stork and just assume that it's okay because I don't see any evil, that covering our eyes is somehow or another stopping the onslaught of wickedness, the onslaught of our change in society, the onslaught of the church losing its privileged place, if there ever was such a thing, in society. We may not resonate with all things emerging, but that does not negate that the emerging church is taking the challenge of postmodernity seriously. We all face the same challenges of the change in perspective in society, and we must make whatever changes are necessary to effectively engage our community with the gospel of Jesus Christ. We must distinguish between the essentials of the gospel and the cultural trappings we have become accustomed to, shedding the latter as necessary while staying faithful to the gospel. You know, we've gotten used to doing church a certain way, and as society changes, we've got to let go. Or in our church that has its foundation in style from the 60s and the 70s, as we hang on to that and society moves on, we will seem just as irrelevant to the coming generations as those who clung on to their hymns and their organs. We've got to distinguish between the essentials and the cultural trappings, and constantly adapt the cultural trappings while we hang on to the essentials of the gospel. We must not indiscriminately adopt the teachings and methodologies of the emerging church because they are hip and new and because everybody likes them, but only insofar as they can be utilized as effective tools for evangelization and discipleship. In other words, adapt what is usable, but don't cave in. Third, we must carefully evaluate everything new and old equally, constantly allowing the Holy Spirit to guide us into all truth. We should constantly be evaluating, constantly changing, constantly moving things. Some years ago, I was pastoring in a church. I'd been taken an existing church, and I walked in, and it was quite different than what I was accustomed. And people always sat in their certain pew in their certain way every week. And one week, a new couple came visiting the church and came in and sat down. And an older couple that always sat right where this couple was came in. Well, they came in late like they always came in late. And they walked thinking this place would always be empty because everybody knew to leave it open to them. And they walked down, and there was this brand new visiting couple sitting in their spot. They stood over them for, I kid you not, 5 minutes during the worship with their hands crossed, glaring them down like, are you going to move or not? And finally, when they didn't move, they sat in the row directly behind them, what was open, and the whole service made little snide comments. Well, of course, we never saw that visiting couple again. They were like, well, we can tell we're not here. So now as a church, and I don't want pews, I want chairs. And about every 3 to 6 months, I change the seating. Maybe we'll go to tables. Maybe we'll go to flat. Maybe we'll go to a round. Maybe we'll go to slanted. Maybe we'll have 2 aisles or 3 aisles or 1 aisle. I'm always changing it around because I found that if I fight people on it, I'm going to lose. But if I just simply change the seating arrangement, every now and then when people come, their favorite seat isn't there. There's no battle. There's just no chair there, and it stirs things up and keeps people fresh. So we can find ways to constantly keep things fresh and new and not get caught into old patterns. We must strive for building bridges to both the world as well as those from a different Christian perspective than us. We've got to be building bridges out, not burning our bridges. God is not honored by our incessant criticism and degrading of one another. And I just want to say, if you've been criticizing this church or this person or that person, and I have to admit the mood is a lot better than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was awful. Now our criticism's out in the world rather than within the church. But if you found yourself incessantly criticizing styles or churches or whatever, maybe you just need to get down on your knees and ask the Lord for forgiveness and say, Lord, forgive me for criticizing your children. They're your children. Let the Lord deal with them. That's not your job. Your job isn't to criticize and degrade. Your job is to honor Christ. Instead of telling someone else what they're doing wrong, lead by example, by winning the lost and building a Christian community that's admirable and worthy of being a model. Well, let's move on. Part of the issue comes down to what is the church? I mean, if we don't know what is the church, how do we know what we're reproducing? Or are we just reproducing what we see? The word church, as should be fairly familiar, comes from the Greek word ekklesia, which most likely was taken from the Septuagint. Now, if you don't know your biblical theology, in the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. And when the Jews were scattered in exile, they lost their ability to speak Hebrew, and they took on the languages where they were. Some that moved down to Egypt took on Greek, and others took on Aramaic. And then when they came back, they increasingly were having troubles reading the Hebrew Bible, and especially those around in the Hellenistic world. They could no longer speak Hebrew, so they could no longer read their Bibles. So in Alexandria, Egypt, they translated the Hebrew into the Greek, which we call the Septuagint. And in the Septuagint, they translated the Hebrew. Well, the word that in the Old Testament, whenever the assembly would gather before Moses, or the assembly would gather and David would gather assembly or whatever, the word for assembly in the Hebrew, they translated by the word ekklesia in the Greek. So that word means assembly. Now, to the Greeks, it was their town assembly, but that was the closest that the Hebrews had to their sense of the people of God, the assembly of God. And so wherever that word assembly came in, almost exclusively the Septuagint used it to translate assembly. So then when Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my ecclesia, we hear, I will build my church. And we're thinking of like our church, like he's going to build up our church with its, with its organs and pews, or guitars and flashing lights and smoke. I mean, that's what we see. But what Jesus was really saying, and they would have understood immediately what he was saying, they would have been familiar with the ecclesia, was the people of God, and he would have been saying, I'm going to build up my people of God, because his followers were becoming the new Israel, the new people of God. This wasn't a church meeting. This was the people of God, my church, the people of God, my assembly. As such, the church is a community. Whenever we make the church into an institution, we dishonor the New Testament understanding of the church. This is certainly a corrective that the emerging church makes. The church was first and foremost the people of God, lived out in authentically in community, not in often in if not often in communal living. I didn't say that well. Let's say that again. In the early church, they lived together. They often had communal living. If not in communal living, they were at each other's houses all the time, sharing meals all the time. Most of their churches were met in houses. I wouldn't say they had house churches. That's just what they had. They met in houses. They were mostly smaller groups of 40 to 60, maybe 100, 120. There's only a couple places that had churches, maybe the church in Rome, maybe the church in Jerusalem, that got into the tens of thousands. Some believe that the church in Jerusalem eventually grew to about 20,000. Some believe the church in Rome grew to about 100,000. But they didn't all meet in one place. They met in hundreds of houses around the community, and then they would meet together as a whole every now and then, like at the temple or whatever. And so they understood it was about community. Where'd that come from? Jesus lived in community with his disciples. So they just modeled what Jesus did. He lived in community. So when the emerging church says we should live it out in community, we should not necessarily worry about mega churches. We should be living out an authentic community where we can hold each other accountable. They're more biblical than we are sometimes. Secondly, the New Testament church was dedicated to mission rather than preservation. The New Testament church wasn't about surviving and hanging on, again, losing their preferred place in culture. The New Testament church was about getting out there into the world and proclaiming the gospel. This is another positive corrective of the emerging church. Although too often the clear evangelistic mission established by Jesus is hijacked for post-modernity ideals or culturally popular agendas. So the goal of the New Testament was to share the mission of God, which is to proclaim the good news of God's love, not to do good service in the community. Now, there's nothing wrong with serving the community, but if at some point you're not proclaiming the love of God at some juncture somewhere, then you've drifted off your mission, or off the New Testament mission. The third section of the church is that they had cultural appropriate settings. And that is another key important distinctive for an effective church. If we want to be purist, I mean, if you want to say, but this is the way it should be. Well, if you want to be purist, then organs and pews must give way, buildings must give way to sitting in round with men on one side and women on the other, and the woman wearing veils. I mean, the scripture even says, if the woman isn't going to wear a veil, let her be considered like a prostitute. So are you making all your women wear veils, right? Come on, or is this culturally controlled? And there are no electronic instruments, and you got to use candles because they didn't have electricity, so they had no electronic instruments, so they use acoustic instruments, acoustic singing, and candles in their services as they sat in the round. I mean, I think if you were to visit an emerging church, a contemporary church, and the New Testament church, you'd say the emerging church looked more like the New Testament church than our other church does. So before we get to, high and mighty that our way is right, We got to get back to the roots of the whys and not the whats. Okay, let's move on. Some distinctive issues relating to the emerging church. Number one is attractional versus missional. Much is made that the New Testament church was missional and that they went to the lost rather than attractional, asking the lost to come to them. Well, yes and no. I mean, this comes from Hirsch and Frost. They talk about in Australia that some of the areas are so huge you couldn't even put a fence around it. So what they do is they sink a water hole and they keep it full of water. And they know that every day the animals are going to come to drink water. So if there's no water for 1,000 miles and there's one watering hole, they don't need fences. They just put water. In the evening, they just wait and the flocks come to them and then they grab whatever they want because they don't need fences. And so they say that Jesus is like the water, that we don't need fences being orthodoxy or membership or something that determines who's an out. Well, we've got to ask, are you coming to the water or are you leaving the water? Are you coming to the water or are you leaving the water? If you're coming to the water, then you're coming to faith. If you're leaving the water, well, then you're walking away from faith. And so that's kind of the idea. And they say, therefore, that we shouldn't be attractional. Attractional would be putting on a big show, having guest speakers and fancy stuff and all the trappings. So we have this magnificent service that people come to watch because it's so glorious. So we ask people to come and see so that they can be saved. Rather than us going to them and sharing. They said Jesus went from town to town. Paul went from place to place. They went out sharing the gospel rather than sitting smugly in a central place saying to the world, well, if you want the gospel here, come to us. So that's what the whole relational, missional versus attractional issue is all about. So was the early church missional rather than attractional? Well, let me say it again. Yes and no. Indeed, they did go to the lost. But when they went to the lost, they proclaimed the gospel. And in the process, the lost also came and visited them. Jesus went on many occasions to cities or even individuals. He'd be in a group where there might have been 10,000 people he's preaching to, and someone would come and say, my daughter's sick. And he'd leave the huge crowd to go pray with one individual. Tell me that a pastor would do that today in the middle of a service to 10,000 people. Someone would say, my daughter's dead. He'd say, okay, everybody, that's it for today. I'm leaving. And then walk off to go pray with one little girl off somewhere. I mean, but Jesus did. Then again, great crowds came to him when they heard the fame of him, so that, quote unquote, he could no longer move freely. And so he would go out into desert places or deserted places, and people came to him. So is that missional or attractional? He was on mission, and yet attractionally they came to him. Paul went from town to town, but in 1 Corinthians 14, he speaks at length about making the service intelligible to non-believers, mentioning that those who sit in the seat of the unlearned. So while they were on mission, they expected people to come and to check out the church and to see and had special seats for those who weren't believers. Further, in Acts 19:9, we're told that Paul taught daily in Ephesus in the lecture hall of Tyrannus, so that people throughout the region heard the word of the Lord. So is that missional or attractional? He was on mission because that wasn't his home city. He went there, but then he rented a hall and preached every day, all day in this hall, and people came to him. So it was both missional. He was on mission, but it was attractional because they came to him. Thus, in my opinion, the entire argument of attractional versus missional is artificial and based upon partial truths. The reality is that the early church was focused on mission and did whatever it took to proclaim the gospel and exhort people to repent and turn from God, expecting in return that they would come to God, come to faith, and become practicing believers that met together on a regular basis. A second issue is relating to proximity spaces. Oftentimes, emerging churches will have proximity spaces. Now, maybe you haven't heard of what a proximity space, so let me define a little bit. A proximity space is the thought behind it is choosing to live within a secular community by operating a business that engages secular postmoderns in daily conversations and relationship which has no religious connection. The goal is for evangelism to evolve through naturally developing relationships and conversation. Often the proximity space becomes the meeting place for the worship service. Is it biblical? Again, well, yes and no. Before we get in that, let me explain a little bit further. For example, I know of multiple different kinds of proximity spaces. I know of people who started coffee shops. And by that, I don't mean like a casual coffee shop. I mean like a competing space to Starbucks, but not a Starbucks. They go and start with their own name, and maybe like our church is called The Connection. So maybe they'd call it Connection Coffee Shop, and they would start a coffee shop in the community, and they would make it their goal to make the best coffee. So they would buy the best beans and hand grind them and go to school and learn how to make the very best coffee in town. And then they would lower the prices so that their prices were competitive or maybe just slightly under the big name guys, but they would give personal service and better coffee with the goal of becoming recognized as the number one best coffee shop in the area. And then as that, the pastoral staff of they're pioneering this church and the team members all worked at the coffee shop. Well, they made a living because they're selling coffee, and it's a for-profit business. So they operate as a full-profit business, and they paid each other, but they allowed conversations to take place. Not argumentation, but conversations. And so as they're serving, they'd be talking back and forth with patrons and hopefully looking for ways to bring up the gospel and create relationship and eventually allow to share their space. As relationships begin to develop, then they say, hey, we're going to start a Bible study on Friday nights. If you're interested, come on here. We'll give everybody free coffee and we'll just talk about the Bible. And so out of that, before you know it, you have Friday night church services going on and so on and so forth. And I know people have done this with coffee shops, I know people who are doing this with laundromats, because especially among poor communities or inner city communities, and they'll buy them. Often they'll buy the laundry, the stuff for the poorest people, and then they hold their services right in the laundromat. I even know some who are having. There's at least 2 in Foursquare. They're doing bars, if you can believe that, where they have a working bar, and then on Friday night they have it, and you say what you want, but they're trying to get into the community. Well, let's ask. Is that biblical? Well, yes and no. Paul worked in the community whenever he needed to support himself. And in the process, evangelism became a byproduct. So I don't think Paul deliberately said, I'm going to go and start a proximity space. He just said, I got to have to feed myself. I don't have any money. And so he went out and he knew how to make tents. That's what he did as a profession. So he started making tents. And he took on partners and he's sharing his faith. And people come there and he's sewing away. He's just talking about the gospel. And you ought to know Jesus. And he's just, going at it as he's making the tents. And people tolerated him because they wanted to buy his tent. I mean, that's how Paul met Priscilla and Aquila. And it's not quite clear whether they were believers and met with him or whether he converted them. It seems to imply he took them on as partners, and before you know it, they converted and became his first team members. And so, yeah, you could kind of call that a proximity space. But then again, as soon as his companions came with money, he quit the tent making so he could devote himself to the gospel. So he saw it as a necessary to survive, not as an inroads to the gospel. But he'd rather sit in the marketplace while people are shopping and talk with anyone who came through. My perspective, to be honest, whatever advances the gospel, whatever works, go for it. If it's leading people to Jesus, do it. But if it's not leading people to Jesus, cut it loose. But we must be brutal in evaluating our effectiveness according to our stated objectives. If we're not careful, we will fall into the same trap as many church schools have, whereby the church loses itself in operating a school at the expense of a ministry. I know many churches have said, we're going to have a school because it'll service the needs of our congregation. It'll draw new people in. Before you know it, the church is running a school, and there is no church. There's just a school, and all the staff and everything's all about keeping the school going and keeping the parents happy. And don't get too preachy because the parents will be unhappy and pull their students, and we won't be able to afford it. And before you know it, the church school is a business, and the church is no longer a church. Hirsch and Frosch, in The Shaping of Things to Come, mentioned with admiration about a failed pastor who had tried in 3 different churches to pastor, and he failed every time, and he gave up, and he just opened a shoe store in San Francisco. They mentioned that during its 3 years of operation, his shoe store, not a single person accepted Christ. But they gleefully proclaimed that he'd had more conversations with secular people in that shoe store than his entire previous ministry. Well, that may be true, but if all he ever did was talk with no change in people's commitment to Christ, how is that really any different than the ineffective Christendom church that they so relentlessly condemn? In contrast, the 2 years of speaking in Ephesus, the entire region had stopped in to hear and consider the gospel, and the church grew tremendously. So that we have more conversations, if those conversations don't result in people coming to Christ, it's no better than if we have no conversations at all. At somewhere, people need to be engaging the gospel and coming to a place of faith. If not, then we need to reevaluate our approach and realize we're not called to simply proclaim. We're called to make disciples. Again, my fourth point here, to be clear, whatever engages the lost and brings people to faith, that is a good thing. In the 70s, we had coffee houses before the days of Starbucks, so as to engage the lost where they were more comfortable conversing about God. I remember in the late 70s, I established a coffee house called The Net. It was just a block and a half from the pier in downtown Huntington Beach. And we saw many come to Christ. In fact, it's a small little room that would sit maybe 20 people, and we'd pack in 60 people in there, and literally 55 of the 60 people would be backpackers and kids coming to the beach and surfers and stuff, which had no Christian background whatsoever. And we saw so many people come to Christ. But there's a season and place for everything. And when it grew to the winter and got cold and everybody left, then we sat in an empty coffee house that Christians came and had coffee in, and we realized it was no longer serving its purpose, and it ran its course. Okay, let's talk about our third issue, and that is church size. Church size is not what you might think. A study in 2016 by the Barna Group noted that 8% of people attend a church over 1,000. 9% attend a church between 500 and 1,000. 37% attend a church between 100 and 500, and 46% attend a church of 100 or less. In other words, the vast majority of believers, 83% of every believer in America that is going to church on a regular basis, attends churches that are considered smaller mid-sized, under 500, with only 17% attending churches considered large or mega. Thus, we must stop considering church attendance measured by reportable numbers as being the ultimate success of a church. By promoting and saying only those who have, and we're talking that we're at 8% of churches over 1,000. And often I know people of churches of 1,000 think, well, we're just kind of a smaller church. We're not like so-and-so who runs 5,000 or 10,000 or 15,000. Well, there's a handful of those churches in the whole United States with 300 million plus people living in this country. And so combine the total attendance of those super mega churches is maybe several hundred thousands of people with hundreds of millions of people in our nation. Those churches are not where the bulk of Christianity is. The bulk of Christianity, 83%, is in small and smaller mid-sized churches. That's just to be honest here. And so we've got to look at what success really is. It's not by how many people we can coax to come to us. Success should be by how many people are being converted into growing disciples of Christ. Are they finding faith and growing in Christ? How many believers are finding and using their spiritual gifts and definable ministry? Are they just coming, or are we helping them become equipped and putting them into work for serving the King? How many leaders are being raised and sent out? And not just raised. Not how many leaders are we getting raised to serve our system? How many are we laying our hands on? Do we have our Pauls and Barnabases and Silases that we're sending out, that leave our church and not just an extension campus who we still got control over, but are going out to engage the lost throughout the world or throughout the nation or throughout the community? Are we sending leaders out? Are we acquiring from other places and sending them out? Or are we raising people up from the world, discipling them, training them, encouraging them, raising the leadership, and sending them out so the people on the street are people who actually accepted Christ under our leadership? How the church effectively and creatively engages its community world is our fourth area. Is the church effectively and creatively engaging its community world? Is it in the world making a difference? Is it establishing itself? And in our own approach, we serve the community aggressively. And the thought is, when we first came, the community people said, the connection, what is that? Oh, that's weird. And so we just got in and started serving because the Lord told us to. And now when you say, where are you from? The connection, oh, I've seen that church. Where have they seen it? They've seen us serving in the community. They've seen us in the parade. They've seen us, cleaning up the schools. They've seen us at all the community concerts, serving at the concerts or cleaning up the trash or whatever. We serve our community, and our whole goal, we recognize when we're serving our community, we're not trying to evangelize. We're just trying for people to look and say, I don't go to church, but if I ever went to a church, that's the kind of church I'd go to. So we recognize that then when we go out evangelistically, or we have events that are evangelistic, that people will say, I've always wanted to check that church out. So success should be measured by, are we getting people to become from non-believers to growing disciples? Are they becoming defined in ministry according to their gifting? Are we raising up leaders, sending them out? And are we engaging and serving our world? A few observations. Many pastors feel right now like a failure. Some of you are from really substantial works and you're listening to me thinking, I'm great. But many of you listening to this, and maybe you were just like feeling like, I feel like such a failure, because it feels like everybody's going to these mega churches, and you feel like, I've got my 50 people or my 60 people or my 30 people, and I'm such a failure, and maybe if I go back and get some more training, and we don't realize the impact that corporately we're making together. I mean, Pastoral Care 2017, I've given you the reference here, and they have a whole bunch of stats, but I just picked a few of them. 54% of pastors find the role of pastor overwhelming. 70% of pastors do not have someone they consider to be a close friend. 70% of pastors report having a lower self-image than when they started. Wow. We think these pastors are full of themselves. 70% say they have a lower self-image than when they started. And 80% believe pastoral ministry has negatively affected their families. Folks, those are staggering statistics. This is a 2017 report. Thus, encouraging pastors of churches of all size should be one of our most important priorities. I'm just done with pastors looking down the nose at smaller guys in churches serving in smaller places, and kind of like, well, we could just take you over, kind of an attitude that dismisses the value of that. And the reality is that if we're going to win our world, we're not going to win it out of the small percentage of the super large. We need to be operating on all cylinders. We need the vast majority of pastors and churches and believers to rise up together in unity and stop the bickering and fighting and say, let's reach our world, whatever it takes. To their credit, for the most part, the emerging churches are small and caring communities, and that is one of their strengths. As such, they represent a more biblical model than attempting to build large but impersonal mini denominations. But don't forget Acts 2, of course, as I mentioned previously, where the first church was a huge mega church, which grew to 20,000 or more. Unfortunately, the emerging church will not be exempt from the trend to largeness, and already those within and without the movement are aware of who leads the larger emerging churches. And so we look at a few mega emerging churches and we all go, ooh, and in the process have lost sight of the thousands and tens of thousands of people who are taking serious the gospel and trying to live it out in community. Well, that kind of brings me up to the house church movement. And instead of doing a full assessment, there's so much similarity between the house church movement and the emerging church. And someone in the house church might say, no, we have nothing to do with the emerging church. Well, it may have nothing to do with the style, but it has everything to do with the approach of getting people into community. And each week as we go through our teaching, I'm going to be sharing the pros and cons of the various different models that we see. But this week, as I was doing some research to beef up my lecture, I found an excellent blog by Steve Brimmer on what the house church movement is doing, both right and wrong. In fact, he did two blogs, and he himself says, I tend towards the negative, so I wrote the positive first and then the negative. And as I read through that, I thought about, kind of outlining. Stuff was so good. I thought about outlining it and just sharing it with you, and I thought, no, that wouldn't be fair to Steve. And so instead, on your reading, I put that as part of our required reading to read his blogs on this subject. They're not long, but it does such a great assessment of the strength and the weakness. For here, it would be that they want to get people in the community, but sometimes the orientation then becomes rather than a positive, let's build community and let's reach our world, it can end up drawing people from a negative who are running from the large church. And so all the time spent on what's wrong with that church over there, then what's right with what God is doing in here. And so someone kind of laughingly shared a perspective that it's more true than we'd like to admit. They say that the emerging church is a bunch of angry young guys, and that the house church movement is a bunch of angry old white guys. And maybe it's a little bit more broad than that now, but there is some truth to that kind of overgeneralization. And we just got to make sure that we're inclusive. I saw some stats. Now the stats are old and I don't know what the current statistics are, but in 2006, it showed that approximately 20% of all believers said that they were going to a house church rather than a main church. That's just an astounding. And as you heard me intimate earlier, we're not quite so sure in some of the church attendance statistics what percentage of those people, that's 20% of believers, say they go to a house church rather than a church. Those are astounding figures. That's just astounding figures. And if that's true, we don't know what part of the quote unquote unchurched nons they're saying, no, I don't go to church, because they're thinking I go to my house church or my simple church. And so how much that plays into this or not, it's not a well-defined area right now, but it could be far more significant than we realize. The downside, though, is that a house church, I found this in my own ministry, that without a building, it's hard for people to grasp onto it. And so even as a church plant, until we got our own building, as long as you're meeting in schools or whatever, it sounds wonderful for someone who's saying, church should just be in rented facilities or whatever forever. Yeah, well, you tried doing that for 5 or 10 years. And besides wearing everybody out, there's a lack of legitimacy. You don't want to go to Starbucks in a mobile cart that comes up in front of your office every day. You want to go to the fancy Starbucks with air conditioning down the hall with the cushy seats that you can sit in and read. And there's a credibility that the food vendors on the street don't have with an established venue. In the same way, the church has a credibility when you have a visible place that people can see. And so house churches struggle with that. The other thing they struggle with, oh gosh, I just lost my thought. So anyway, I love house churches. And so let's move on. Concluding thoughts. Regardless of what is taught academically in the universities, we all face the subtle laissez-faire attitudes towards truth and righteousness that is pervading society, even affecting the thoughts and actions of believers. If we're true to our calling, we will continually adjust our style and methodology to better reach a constantly changing society, but all without compromising biblical truth in the process. We should never grow smug in our size, but always passionate about reaching the lost. And finally, we need to stop criticizing each other because someone has a different style or size of church. Instead, joining our efforts together to reach a lost and dying world. Well, that's my thought on postmodernity, on the emerging church, and on the house church movement. I look forward to reading. We've in our discussion this week, it's kind of open-based, so it gives you a little bit more latitude. We look forward to seeing your thoughts on the matter.